Before the Tet Offensive, Robert Kennedy's bid for president, and LBJ's shocking announcement. Before the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy, and riots across the country. Before a tumultuous Democratic convention in Chicago and the election of Richard Nixon as president. Before all this, in 1968, there was Senator Eugene McCarthy, better known as Gene. In late 1967, he stood up alone and something happened. Oh, did it ever. This is his story. Say hi, Gene, and let's meet the real Senator McCarthy. Nothing divides a nation like war, whether at home or abroad. By the late 1960s, America's military involvement in Vietnam split a country. The primary recipient of protest against the war was President Lyndon Johnson, who in 1967 continued to send American troops to fight in Southeast Asia.
The issue of the War of Vietnam was more than just a little mistake made in some strange, faraway country.
Vance Opperman was a law school student at the University of Minnesota in 1968 when he became the student leader for the McCarthy campaign.
It was a generational divide. It was seen as, on the one hand, the result of corrupt, uninformed, cynical politics, which I believe it was, and on the other, by people that wanted to be involved and felt that they wanted to have some role in their own government and felt they had been excluded from that process.
You could go down Pennsylvania Avenue some days and hear the chant right outside the White House fence of, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" I mean, it got very, very vicious.
The main thing, I think, were all the demonstrations going on outside. And Johnson, I don't know how Johnson reacted to that. I think that he thought they must be from not just unworldly, but from some other planet.
For too long, the political system has been a political system of bosses and of parties and of leadership. I mean, that great phrase, union leader and this kind of leader and that kind of leader. The people just don't dig their leaders.
The theory that the way to go to end the war was to build opposition to Lyndon Johnson within the Democratic Party, and that such opposition was possible because you could stand in any street corner and talk to your person on the left and the person on the right, and whether they had different positions on the war in Vietnam, they both hated Lyndon Johnson.
We were so angry with Johnson, and he was against Johnson, and that's all we needed. I still remember, saying to somebody, my dog, I don't think I even had a dog at the time, was running. Maybe somebody else said it, and we would support him.
Anti-war leaders Al Lowenstein and Curtis Gans started the Dump Johnson movement, and separately began seeking a Democratic candidate to challenge fellow Democrat, President Johnson, in his bid for re-election. U.S. Senators Robert Kennedy and George McGovern, among others, were all approached. They all said no.
He didn't want to be seen just as running against Lyndon Johnson as some sort of vendetta. He wanted to be seen as really stating out a position about the war in Vietnam and what needed to be done there.
So Lowenstein and Gans considered another option, Senator Eugene McCarthy from Minnesota. McCarthy hailed from the same state as Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey.
And along the way, at one point, I think we probably had 15 or 20 senators who had made some kind of challenging commitment against the war in 66 and 67.
I've been reading about your concern on the bombing. I understand the basis of your concern and doubt and perhaps fear.
So it became clear to me that the Senate was not going to, in any kind of effective way, challenge the war in Vietnam. The only thing left to do was really to make it an issue in the campaign. The fact that no one else would do it didn't, to my mind, say, if no one does it, I don't have to do it. The fact that if no one does it, you have to do it.
On November 30th, 1967, Senator Eugene McCarthy announced he would challenge President Johnson in primaries in Wisconsin, Nebraska, Oregon, and California. McCarthy later made a decision that would forever change the course of the 1968 presidential campaign.
Actually, the people in New Hampshire asked us to come in, and the troops were getting restless. You know, sometimes you got an army, you got to let them go, even though they shouldn't go. And so we were persuaded to go to New Hampshire.
They had legions of young people, but they were called Clean for Gene because they had pigtails, they had scruffy beards, they had beads, and if you were going to go out and campaign for Senator McCarthy and knock on doors and say, let me tell you why you should back this senator from Minnesota, the thought was you ought to clean yourself up. And so the name stuck, Clean for Gene, the young kids.
Each year, runners take to the streets of Manchester, New Hampshire for the Shamrock Shuffle. But once every 4 years, folks from across the country converge on the Granite State, with a population of just more than 1.3 million, for a different type of race, the battle for President of the United States. Starting in late 1967, New Hampshire residents experienced something they had never before seen.
I think the young people, because that was really the first time they had been used in that way, provided an enormous and refreshing focus to the campaign. But it wasn't only that.
Curtis Gans, who was a civil rights organizer of 1960 lunch counter sit-ins in North Carolina, was 30 years old when he joined the McCarthy campaign as a voter organizer in New Hampshire.
And what was unique was, citizens rallied, to save their country. What was unique, was, that you had, I think at that time, a pretty good marriage of man and movement, because I think Gene McCarthy for the state of New Hampshire was a pretty ideal candidate.
The most amazing thing is this was a widespread grassroots effort to seize control of a policy, the policy in this case of foreign intervention, that had previously not been seized by the grassroots. It had always been imposed from on top.
I found that the students were genuinely concerned about the substance of Vietnam, but also concerned about political processes, and there were demonstrations, as you know, and talk about non-politics and of no votes and demonstrations, and that I sensed that most of them really wanted to do something more or less within the system if they were given a chance.
The candidates themselves, Johnson and McCarthy, though both Democrats, could not have been more dissimilar.
There was this cleanness that, in
Purity.
addition to everything else, that Johnson never had. I mean, I just remember picking up his dog by his ears and showing us his appendix and all those other kinds of things. And so, people personalize politics a whole bunch. And so Eugene McCarthy was able to frame a different narrative about how things could be.
To understand this fully, you have to realize that Gene is what experts in Irish history call peat bog Irish. It means the Irishman that sits there staring into a peat bog and thinking very deep thoughts.
George Reedy was previously a press secretary for President Johnson before returning to the White House to help with the re-election campaign.
To Johnson had a very keen intellect from the standpoint of a superb brain, but he didn't understand intellectuality for the sake of intellectuality. To him, an idea meant something you did something with. To Gene McCarthy, an idea meant something that illuminated the world for him.
Sam Kaplan was 14 years old when he first campaigned door-to-door for one of McCarthy's congressional campaigns.
And the fact that Gene McCarthy wanted to do this in his elegant way was very appealing.
Mary McCarthy, the senator's daughter, took a leave of absence from Radcliffe to work on the campaign. She not only influenced her father's decision to challenge President Johnson, but was also largely responsible for recruiting student volunteers to work on the campaign.
They said we were amateurs, and they said we were disorganized, but On the ward level, I don't think New Hampshire had ever seen anything that organized. They'd never had a door-to-door canvass, and I think it was very effective.
Students came in droves to work for McCarthy in various states. In New Hampshire alone, as many as 2,000 college students took time off from school to work full-time for McCarthy. Another estimated 5,000 volunteered on weekends.
We would lecture them, and we'd say, you're here, to oppose the war, right? And they'd say, right. But people in New Hampshire support the war, right? Right. Therefore, we don't talk about the war except perhaps in terms of its endless quality. What we talk about is honesty and integrity.
Some of the people might feel a little bit offended that their town is being invaded by college students, but we can turn it right around. We've come all the way out here because we believe so strongly in Senator McCarthy and want to help him.
They were the first generation of activists in modern times, of young people in politics. In my generation, in the early 50s, we drank beer. We crammed for exams. Politics was something that was out there, but it was not something that we spent a lot of time on.
Eugene James McCarthy was born March 29, 1916, in the central Minnesota town of Watkins, where he attended St. Anthony Catholic Grade School. McCarthy later enrolled at St. John's Prep High School in Collegeville, Minnesota, and then St. John's University next door. While at St. John's, he excelled in the classroom, earning him the nickname the Watkins Wonder. He also played semi-pro baseball during the summers and hockey for St. John's in the winters. Following graduation in 1935, McCarthy, at age 19, taught in high schools in Minnesota and North Dakota, before eventually returning to teach at St. John's. His upbringing and time at St. John's, including 9 months he spent as a Benedictine novice considering the priesthood, solidified a faith and moral background that would later shape his politics. In the words of historian Dominic Sandbrook, his Catholicism was the single most important thing about him.
Much of Senator McCarthy's positions in politics came from a well-defined, an unusually well-defined moral sense.
In 1946, now married to Abigail Quigley, McCarthy moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, and became a professor of sociology at the College of St. Thomas. In 1948, political opportunity greeted McCarthy, who ran for the United States Congress from the 4th District of Minnesota.
His campaign, I've heard the stories about it from colleagues at St. Thomas, was run out of a mimeograph machine in the basement of one of the academic buildings at St. Thomas, probably a violation of every law possible, and they probably never paid for the paper either.
In the House, he was popular and competent, something of a rising star, wrote one historian, who then added, his Senate career was really a disappointment. The McCarthy campaign continued to gather steam in preparation for Election Day in New Hampshire. But one of the biggest boons to the campaign occurred thousands of miles across the globe. On January 31st, 1968, North Vietnamese troops launched an all-out attack on U.S. forces in South Vietnam. It became known as the Tet Offensive.
And when the Tet Offensive actually broke, oh Lord, it just shattered almost everything.
1 week prior to the election in New Hampshire, voters in McCarthy's home state of Minnesota prepared to meet in caucuses. In both states, the get-out-the-vote efforts remained intense.
I remember a man chasing me down the hallway of an apartment building over on Stevens Avenue because he was incensed. He was a long, strong Humphrey supporter and couldn't imagine long-haired hippies, as we were always called. We were always long-haired hippie communists, usually. And sometimes there were aspersions as to one's sexual orientation thrown in there for good measure.
This is Tony Randall. How will you feel? Just stop and think for a moment. How would you feel if you woke up Wednesday morning and found that Eugene McCarthy had won the New Hampshire primary? Wouldn't you feel that suddenly there was new hope for America?
March 12, 1968. Voters went to the polls in New Hampshire. Even on Election Day, despite a strong surge by the McCarthy campaign, President Johnson was still the odds-on favorite to win big.
The press said we'd get 12% in New Hampshire. We knew that was wrong. Elmer Davis, an old newspaper man at the time, said if there are only two people contesting in any American political contest, anybody can get 20%. So we said, well, we'll get twice as much as the press said we did. And in New Hampshire, you don't have to win, you just have to beat the spread.
In the end, McCarthy astounded everyone by getting 42% of the vote. President Johnson won with 49.5%. But when the write-in votes from the Republican ballots were counted, the senior senator from Minnesota came within a mere 524 votes of defeating the incumbent president of the United States.
Now, the next morning, the attention clearly turned to Senator Kennedy. He'd said he wasn't going to run. But our desk in New York, the ABC News desk, found out that he was coming back to Washington that morning aboard an American Airlines plane. And I was dispatched as a correspondent in the Washington Bureau to go out to National Airport and see if I could talk to him.
Sam Donaldson, who later earned fame for his coverage of the White House, was a young reporter for ABC News in Washington, D.C.
The crew set up. And to my surprise, we were the only ones there. I mean, not just the only broadcast reporters there or television people there, but there weren't any other reporters there. Kennedy got off the plane, and I approached him and said, Senator, speak to you a moment. He paused for a moment. And I said, in light of what happened in New Hampshire yesterday, are you going to reconsider your decision not to run for the presidency? He said, yes, I'm reconsidering it, or words to that effect.
Wisconsin, America's Dairyland, the birthplace of the Progressive Party, and the site of the second presidential primary in 1968. In Wisconsin, like other states, women played a pivotal role for the McCarthy campaign. Many of these women had never previously been politically active on their own.
I was speaking at a group in Massachusetts during the campaign, and this man who owned a lot of chain stores came up and he said to me, does your husband know that you're talking about issues? And I said, yes, he sent me here to talk about them. He said, I can't believe that. I'd never let my wife do that.
I think that was where you had the real beginning of women as a separate block of voters, and most of us hadn't caught on yet to how deep that was and how serious it was and how it was changing the whole face of American politics.
The third floor of the McCarthy House in Washington became the Women for McCarthy headquarters.
Well, I started in Washington and worked in the McCarthy attic.
What was that?
In the attic of the McCarthy residence is where the, volunteer activities were initiated for the whole campaign.
When? Early in January?
Yeah.
Who was with you at that time?
Mrs. McCarthy was there, and a lot of her friends, and a lot of the kids that are still involved now.
We kept getting little dribs and drabs of money, and we'd buy more stamps and more postage and more stationery.
The candidate's wife was a force of her own who earned the respect of campaign staffers. And she even had a fan in the Oval Office.
Gene, how are you?
Pretty good.
Glad to hear you. Is that wife still living with you?
Yeah, she's with me.
Well, she's a very understanding, tolerant woman. I've always had great respect for her and great understanding and sympathy for her. Just have to live around a guy like you very long.
Well, is it growing?
Despite momentum on the campaign trail, not everyone was convinced Senator McCarthy was the best candidate to defeat President Johnson. McCarthy's campaign style and sometimes acerbic personality drew criticism from even some of his supporters.
We used to think when we were working hard down in the basement of a building or when we were working in the campaign office, we used to imagine McCarthy and Jerry Ellers, his administrative assistant, sitting up in the room with their feet up.
Jerry Eller once said of McCarthy that I never knew a man who demanded so much total loyalty and gave so little in return.
He was a very clever and proud man who didn't suffer fools gladly, explained historian Dominic Sandbrook. And there's a serious doubt about whether he really wanted to win, to become the nominee and then president.
Well, I said I didn't want to, but I was willing, which is a much stronger commitment than wanting the presidency.
Eugene McCarthy wasn't, 12 events in one day and glad-handing. Eugene McCarthy was, 3 or 4 events in one day.
Along the way to Election Day in Wisconsin, Robert Kennedy officially announced his candidacy for president on March 16th.
I remember that day very well. It was, the family piled into the car, and we went to the Senate caucus room, which is now called the Kennedy caucus room. It was very, very exciting and a little confusing because it wasn't a campaign like the 1960 campaign where John Kennedy had planned to run for years in advance.
On March 29th, with the Wisconsin primary only a few days away, LBJ advisor George Reedy delivered a message to his boss.
So I remember I finally wrote a memo to Johnson, which I was trying to be optimistic, but at the same time bring him face to face with reality, in which I said he could get renominated and could get reelected. But he had to do certain things.
2 days later, on the night of March 31st, President Johnson addressed the nation from the Oval Office. Vance Opperman gathered with other McCarthy supporters in Minnesota to watch the speech.
And there were people in our crowd that thought that Johnson was going to announce some dramatic change in our Vietnam policy, that Humphrey, those were the people that felt that Humphrey was opposed to the war, and that he would work on Johnson and he would be able to persuade Johnson to change the policy.
Good evening, my fellow Americans. Tonight I want to speak to you of peace in Vietnam and Southeast Asia.
The war wore on, and as the result of the opposition to his policies continued, he looked sadder and sadder, and his earlobes seemed to get longer, and his face seemed to get more creased.
I was the anchor for the ABC radio coverage of another presidential speech on Vietnam. It seemed like more of the same.
I have lived daily and nightly with the cost of this war. I know the pain that it has inflicted.
And in fact, we had an advance text of President Johnson's speech, or at least most of it. And I was listening to it, making a note or two, trying to decide what I wanted to say when it was over, when he shocked the world.
Remember, I was in a restaurant at the time, Chinese restaurant. I knew the proprietor very well. He set up a television set so I could watch. Johnson has been scheduled to make a speech that night. Halfway through, I said to my wife, he's going to quit.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Immediately, almost, he ended, and I had to think of something to say, and I was flabbergasted. Here was a man who had used political power all of his adult life, who was the power broker par excellence when he was Senate Majority Leader, and as president had pushed through such tremendous pieces of legislation, the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Voting Rights Act of '65, Medicare of '65, his so-called Great Society. He was behind it. And the thought that Lyndon Johnson would give it all up voluntarily. And now the political world was turned upside down.
I don't know whether my memo had anything to do with it or not. So I never had a real conversation with him after that.
We were overjoyed. It meant that our little efforts, and we were taking more credit, of course, than we were probably entitled, but it meant that our little efforts were nothing more than the iceberg, the tip of the iceberg, and that Johnson, at least, understood more than we did the depth of opposition to his policies in Vietnam.
Senator McCarthy's wife, Abigail, placed a call to President Johnson shortly after his announcement.
The minute he came on the phone, I realized that I was a little bit mistaken about his attitude, because there was a certain sort of the Machiavellian side of Lyndon Johnson reflected in his answer and in his voice.
Well, I just thought we had to do it because there's so much at stake that one little person like me didn't.
You know you aren't one little person.
Well, I've got 9 months now to do nothing except I won't spend one moment doing anything except trying to find peace.
It was a thrilling moment. just a thrilling moment. And this really was people rising up. When you think about it, this was the most ambitious politician in the modern history of America, who was withdrawing from the race to get reelected, and that was such an amazing thing.
On April 2nd, Senator McCarthy won the Wisconsin primary with 56% of the vote. Following McCarthy's Wisconsin victory, Robert Kennedy claimed wins in Indiana and Nebraska primaries. McCarthy handed Kennedy a loss in the Oregon primary, the first electoral loss a Kennedy ever experienced. After a close primary, Kennedy claimed victory in California during a rally at the Ambassador Hotel and was shot minutes later. He died the following day. By the time of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August, party infighting and McCarthy's detachment paved the way for Vice President Hubert Humphrey to secure the nomination. McCarthy waited until October to publicly throw his support behind his fellow Minnesotan. McCarthy's critics still blame him for Humphrey's loss to Richard Nixon. Maintaining earlier support would have swayed the election's narrow outcome. But despite falling short of becoming president, Senator Eugene J. McCarthy had already solidified his spot in American history.
The President of the United States was obviously lying to us. The American public knew it, they figured it out, and they found out a way to get rid of him. And that's an important lesson for a democratic society to learn. And it's an important lesson for people who are in their 20s to learn.
The thing that he provided for us was a legitimate electoral channel for change, which is what democracy is supposed to be about, which does not come easily.
I think they should remember him as somebody who altered the course of history in a very significant way. He was not intended to be President of the United States, but in an articulate and elegant way, he offered an alternative to a president who was so unpopular because of the war in Vietnam.
It brought all the students, many of the students who had given up on the political process, back into the political process. I think that was the greatest gift of the campaign, really. We've forgotten how divided people were and how the students were literally in the streets before Gene gave them the opportunity to do this politically.
You know, I think McCarthy of 1968 should be looked upon as a patriot. As somebody, who came, in the time of national crisis to the nation's rescue, and salvaged a portion of his country and a portion of his party, in the most eloquent way possible.
It helped Johnson abdicate. It helped open the way to other Democrats. It helped legitimize the protests of the war in the streets of the country, legitimize the young people and women and others who came to protest the war. They weren't just a flock of people who weren't thinking straight. They became what America was against the Vietnam War.
The singular success remains that normal, average, ordinary people had an impact, a pervasive and ultimately successful impact on a major policy mistake that this country had made. That, I think, is an important lesson, and I think that's what history will recount as the most successful part of the McCarthy movement.